Hello and welcome to another live topic from the AML Watcher, your go-to for sanctions, PEPs and adverse media. I'm Mark Bain, your host, CEO of the KYB, a company that provides business-registered data from around the world, uncovering ownership and potential risks. Today, we'll be covering how the differences in EU and US sanction programs make compliance and enforcement a challenge. And for those of you who may be quite new to this, and maybe think, sanctions, what does that mean? Well, sanctions programs implemented by the EU and the US are critical tools for foreign policy, security, economic strategy. In fact, it's fair to say, while both aim to achieve similar goals, some, such as deterring aggressive behavior, promoting human rights, and combating terrorism, they differ in their structure, implementation, and compliance requirements. Now, understanding these nuances and differences is essential for any business operating internationally and to ensure compliance and mitigate risks. Now, to bring this to life, I'm joined by our experts in the field, and I'd first like to bring up to Stephanie Brockhart. Stephanie is a seasoned trade compliance professional with extensive experience in legal and compliance roles across Netherlands and Singapore. As the founder member of Megra, a consultancy firm based in the Netherlands, she specializes in advisory and training services for sanctions and export control compliance. Stephanie is the co-founder also of the Sanctions Consortium and an active member of the International Sanctions and Export Control Society. She is a prolific contributor in this field, regularly published and speaking on keynotes such as this. Stephanie holds a master's degree in the University of Amsterdam and a bachelor's degree in Dutch and European law from Tilburg and Deusto University. So a warm welcome to Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much.
And second on the stage, or no by means least, is Georgina Demitres, a seasoned expert for over 18 years compliance and corporate legal services in Cyprus. As an AML advisor, she has worked with prominent local and international firms across various industries, including corporate, audit, accounting, judicial, and legal sectors. Georgina brings an extensive knowledge of compliance to her functions and actively conducts training sessions and seminars, guiding her clients through the expertise. Georgina holds a bachelor's degree in international and European laws from, let me pronounce this correctly, Kapodistrian Law of University in Athens. Certified AML practitioner from the ICA and an active member of the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners. A warm welcome to you too, Georgina.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Well, I think between you, I think we've definitely got this covered because that's the most I've talked about certifications in my guests for some time. So I think what we'll do is we'll just crack straight in because we've got limited time. And I'd just like to say anyone listening that please add any comments or notes to this chat, and we'll bring up the questions towards the end of the session. So we're going to kick straight off here. And questions that these have been compiled over time, mainly from some of our viewers, actually. So first off, what are sanctions compliance challenges for European companies with regard to compliance with US secondary sanctions following the blockade statute? And do you think there's a conflict between the two? Now, I propose this to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. I think a great opening question. US secondary sanctions might need a little bit of an introduction. Secondary sanctions are a type of extraterritorial measure that the US implements and basically means that whenever we see violations of US sanctions that are actually not applicable primarily in the jurisdiction because it doesn't pertain, for example, a US company who doesn't comply with US sanctions, but it is actually a company that is not subject. So let's put it very practical. It's a Dutch company and it is exporting certain military equipment to Iran, for example. That means that because it is a significant transaction and it is going to Iran and it is very much against the foreign policy objective of the US could actually add that Dutch company to a sanctions list. That is kind of what we mean by secondary sanctions. And a couple of years ago, it starts actually in 1996 when we go back to the Cuba regulations, because the US has an embargo on Cuba, which is the only jurisdiction actually who does have sanctions on Cuba. The European Union doesn't have any sanctions. So what the European Union did was actually to say, you know what, we do not allow our European economic operators to comply with those sanctions. And so when we skip ahead, we saw the snapback of sanctions from Iran. And that means that when we think about the Iran sanctions that were not as extensive under EU sanctions as they were on the US sanctions, that the EU once again said we are going to update our blocking regulations and require that actually EU operators do not comply with the US sanctions. So that, as you can imagine, has a conflicting interest in a sense, because obviously you kind of are stuck in the middle if you have business operations in the US, or for example, you do business in US dollars, which a lot of companies at the end do. So, but since the invasion of Ukraine, this has kind of been going, out of the limelight a little bit, I would say, because the focus has been very much on alignment among the Western G7 countries to actually focus on restraining Russia and not so much on Iran. So the foreign policy objective pretty much aligned for Russia, and it now feels like, especially also from the Biden's administration perspective, that the focus is very much on building the alliance, which was pulled back a little bit under the Trump administration. So the focus is not so much anymore on those conflicts of interest. But of course, when we head towards the election and we might think about maybe Trump being reelected, that comes back to the forefront again, because then we're going to see again divergence on policy on China, Iran, and Russia, the three main sanctioned jurisdictions.
Yeah. Very well explained. Much better than I could have done.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know, Georgina, if you had anything to add into that, or we move on to the next.
Yeah, we can move. Stephanie was so detailed, so she covered everything. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Very clear.
Yeah. Very clear. Yeah. So it's clear to say, one central body in the EU implements sanctions programs, while there are other member states that enforces bodies for enforcing sanctions in their own way. So there's a lack of harmonization in there. Do you think that this, because of this level of member states, it makes it quite difficult to implement from the EU point of view?
Yeah, well, the lack of harmonization complicates the implementation. And if we explore some challenges here, for example, if we see that we have inconsistent in enforcement. So as we have variability in enforcement rigor and the interpretation among the member states, and also the difference between penalties and compliance requirements, create uncertainty for many businesses. We also have operational complexity. Companies must navigate different regulatory landscapes within the EU and have increased administrative burden to ensure compliance with varying national practices. Also, we have legal uncertainty, as there is potential for conflicting legal obligations and interpretations across member states, since they are not following all member states the same approach. And of course, there is a difficulty in maintaining a uniform compliance strategy. That is why each country's sanction release must be taken into consideration. And in cases where we're not sure if this is related to us or not, we should always seek for a legal advice from an expert lawyer of that specific country. For example, if a person or an entity is included, let's say, under the Ukrainian sanctions, and we have such a client, we need to seek for a legal advice from a lawyer in Ukraine to make sure that by offering services, we are not breaching their law. Now, if we further analyze, let's say, the impact on the implementation, we see that there is inefficiency where can lead to gaps and delays in sanctions implementation. And there is also risk of non-compliance due to inconsistent regulations and enforcement mechanisms. So we can definitely conclude here that harmonization at the EU member state level will streamline enforcement, reduce complexity, and improve overall compliance with sanctions programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose then the lack of this harm member states could lead to ineffectiveness in the implementation of sanctions, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Because
I don't know if you've got.
due to the inconsistent enforcement, where we see variable practices dilute the overall impact of sanctions. There is a gap in compliance where we have differences in national regulations and penalties that create loopholes and so reduce different effects. Also, the coordination challenges. We have difficulty in achieving unified action, reduces the efficiency of sanctions as well. That's why the harmonized enforcement is crucial for the effective implementation of EU sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sort of brings us on slightly to you mentioned Russia in the past just now, but if you think about some of those Eastern European countries that border Russian, like Lithuania, Bulgaria, Estonia, they're located quite close. And maybe they face more challenges in sanctions in compliance? What's your opinion on that?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, that's a great point to analyze here, because these countries, due to the proximity to Russia, often face more challenges in sanctions compared to other countries. Having closer economic and trade relationships with Russia make compliance more complex and potentially costly. They have geopolitical and political pressures, which creates tension to balance, compliance with each national economic interest and security concerns. There is a greater political and regional pressure to navigate between EU policies and local economic interests, which may increase also the risk of circumvention and face additional enforcement challenges due to geographic and logistical factors. They may also face cross-border activities, higher likelihood of cross-border transactions, and smuggling attempts due to their geographic location is making enforcement even more difficult. And on the other hand, there are security concerns. Heightened security and geopolitical tensions add layers of complexity to compliance efforts. Hence, having all that said, it's important to have increased monitoring and enforcement to prevent sanctions deviations, which can strain, reduce resources, and complicate their compliance efforts. So it's a big combination.
Yeah, it's a complex minefield when you've got bordering countries. I'm absolutely sure.
Yeah, because they connect everything to if you are next to Russia or you cooperate with Russia. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, lots of people's livelihoods may depend upon that in any case. So it's quite a challenging aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the European Union and the United States may have had contrary position in matters of secondary sanctions, but do you think it puts European business dealing with the United States at a crossroads of choosing the right sanctions and compliance approach? I mean, it's a minefield as it is, but do you think that puts people off? I think this, Stephanie, I don't know if you want to reach this point.
I think it ties into our previous discussion, right, where you see there's more alignment among the G7 members or members, so that means that there's less divergence. But still, I mean, you can see that there's small differences among the different jurisdictions in the way they implement sanctions, the way they allow actually wind down periods, those kind of things, which makes it certainly more difficult. I mean, one of the main things I think from a practical point of view again is the US executive order that actually implements secondary sanctions on financial institutions that continue to do business with Russia. One of the names that are well known for this kind of situation is Raiffeisen Bank, UniCredit. So they are kind of under scrutiny from the US. Well, the big thing is, of course, that certain business is still allowed to go in and out of Russia, and somehow that needs to be also paid for. So that puts these kind of business in a squeeze. And there you, at the end of the day, you also see that the US, the ties with Russia is just not strong. The EU is, right? So, for example, if you look at the Netherlands, it is before the war, it was one of the main trading partners of Russia. Well, if you look at the trade relationship between the US and Russia, it's just easier to implement and enforce sanctions because they don't have so much dependency also from an economic perspective of Russia. And you see that that's also makes it difficult if we look at it from a pure European perspective. Certain member states have been very reliant and are still very much reliant on energy sourcing from Russia. That's why we haven't seen any gas restrictions or oil restrictions quite yet from the EU side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that goes to the point before about bordering countries. I mean, we're in Europe, we are bordering more or less.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. But this is probably more of a practical question, really. How can businesses manage their risks associated with operating under these conflicting sanction regimes?
Sorry, can we repeat the question?
Sorry, that's probably I wasn't clear. How can businesses manage the risk associated with operating under conflicting sanction regimes?
Yeah, so I think it is all about risk management and assessment, right? And to continue doing that on an ongoing basis at the end of the day. So I think generally what I'm seeing in practice is that people start diving into all the due diligence and feel like we need to focus on circumvention because that is kind of the buzzword now when it comes to sanctions. And they just go about it and they tend to be a step ahead in a sense that they implement internal policies. But I think the step that they tend to skip is actually to do a proper risk assessment. So really think about what is your exposure geographically, what is my risk of, my exposure to, for example, countries that are known for circumvention hubs, what is the type of industry that my clients are in a lot. So just make sure that you have a complete picture of what you should be focusing on, because it is a minefield, as you mentioned before. And I think it is so important to focus on the right things, because you can only use your resources once and we don't have unlimited resources, right? So make sure you are smart about it and focus on the high risk, but start identifying what those highest risks are. So that means also when we look at it from a policy perspective, we see all the focus on, for example, the high priority items, right, that are coming out. We have these kind of lists where you see that certain items that are used a lot in military complex and military items that are used in the battlefield. If you are the kind of company that produces these items and you're shipping them to certain countries that are at increased risk from a circumvention perspective, you should be more concerned than the companies who are not active in these type of businesses. And those lists are updated on a pretty frequent basis also. So I think that is just very much a focus also from a banking perspective, because I think they also tend to go a little bit overboard not overboard, but as I mentioned, not taking that first step of identifying really the main risks first.
And I suppose it's understanding who you're supplying, who are they supplying. That's
exactly, yes. Know your customer type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Know your customer's customer. And of course, if you're producing a product that's got semiconductors in it, then clearly that might be a definite need to be a deconstructed product when it gets to a moving entity, if you understand what I mean.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a chain of everything.
And I mean, it makes your jobs much more complex and much more deeper. But just I think from your point there, just understanding and managing those risks associated with it, it's asking the questions, and if there's red flags at the beginning, there's going to be probably huge red flags at the end. So
exactly.
I mean, it brings me on to a little bit the next part. Is the EU is quite prominent in implementing sanctions related to environmental and labour rights and violations in the supply chain. What is the US's approach to this regard? I don't know, Stephanie, if you have something on that, or Gina?
Yeah, sure. So environmental, the EU is big on it, of course. We have the laws and regulations coming up now for environmental social responsibility. That's going to be big. But the US has also been doing something on this side. You might be familiar with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, where the US has this import restriction actually of goods that are made in the Uyghur region, so Xinjiang region of China. And those are actually subject to, very interestingly, a rebuttable presumption that actually those goods are made with forced labor. So that's certain items that are on those lists. And it's kind of up to you as an importer into the US to prove that they're actually not made with forced labor. So that's pretty far-reaching, and the US has also now published a list of entities that should be checked, because those are the kind of entities that are now presumed to be exporters to the US of goods made with forced labor. And there's certain items on the list, agricultural commodities, cotton, tomatoes, from the top of my head, that are on the list that should be checked. So there's a little bit of a different approach from what the EU does, because they also have a Forced Labor Act now, but that is not focused alone on China. And we are also not looking at a rebuttable presumption. So it is still up to the US or the EU authorities to prove that those items are actually made with forced labor. So a different approach that we are seeing here, but it's an upcoming issue. And I also see it in practice that more and more companies, because so many of the European and I mean the world basically implements or imports their stuff, manufactures their stuff in China, right? So this is becoming an increasingly challenging problem, that transactions are being held and shipments are being held over this issue. So I think it is really important that if you are a manufacturer and you have your manufacturing facilities in China, that you really start implementing, or well, at least check these kind of lists, understand what these laws and regulations are, what the risks are, and that you also do audits of the local manufacturers and check out that specific region where the risk is really high, the Xinjiang region of China.
And is it fair to say what you're just saying there is that it's down to the importer to prove the case that actually, no, this isn't
the US, indeed, yeah. So that's the interesting one, but that's very specifically for the US. We don't have that in the EU. Yeah.
So it's not the case in the EU then. That's not down to the importer to prove it.
It's the authorities. Yeah. So I guess that's the customs authorities then that would have to. I don't know how that exactly works, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good point, actually. Just a little anecdotal there. I used to be in a business where I was importing product in from China myself. And so I've seen things firsthand, which I won't go into great detail, but I've seen it being manufactured in places you would be shocked to see being manufactured. So, and of course you don't know. And then it's the man or the person is dealing it out or outsourcing it internally in the country, and you have no idea. So it's quite difficult to answer police, I would imagine.
Yes.
So we'll move on. So there are sort of prudential differences in the imposing of sanctions for the EU and the US. So I think, Georgina, maybe you could talk to this point.
Yeah, sure. We have several differences in how EU and US impose sanctions. For example, let's start from EU sanctions, which includes as their decision-making process. Sanctions are decided by the Council of the European Union, requiring unanimous or qualified majority voting among the member states, and are implemented through the Council regulations, which must be transposed into national laws by the member states. For the implementation, member states are responsible for enforcing sanctions, which can lead to variations in implementation, and for the monitoring. The European Commission provides guidance, which is always updated but enforcement is largely handled at the national level. Also, sanctions are reviewed periodically and can be updated based on the consensus of the member states, where US sanctions include as their decision-making process executive authority. Sanctions are primarily imposed by the president or the treasury secretary under the executive orders and legislative acts, and are implemented by the Office of Foreign Asset Control, known as OFAC, which handles the imposition, administration, and enforcement of sanctions. So for their implementation, compared to EU, there is more centralized enforcement, and it's managed by OFAC with a standardized approach across the US, and maintains a comprehensive list of sanctioned individuals and entities, which is applied uniformly. And those lists are updated according to the developments that are coming through. Also, in regards to review and their update, US are they have frequent adjustments where sanctions can be updated or modified quickly based on executive orders or new legislative directives. So, to summarize, we can see that the EU's approach involves a multi-step consensus-based process, while the US utilize a more centralized and executive-driven process with more immediate and uniform enforcement.
So I think I have sort of one question sort of just buzzing around in my head about this. I can imagine some of our users talking about this, and we often get asked this question anyway: how often do things change, and how quick? So how quick does it get? I mean, I don't know if either of you can answer this. It's not enough.
For example, with EU, we can see that they have this, that they issue packages through the year. They might have 3 and 4 packages per year with more restrictions, bans, either the cross-border, the traveling, to export and import products, because they want to make sure, that the sanctions are followed, because they can see that for example, there is a restriction, let's say, from Russia to Cyprus. So what they do, they can export the products to a different country that can import to, the Cyprus can import the products. And so they are not sanction-based.
Yeah.
That's why US is different. They are more like with the designated entities and individuals. When they see something where something is being reported and they need to check it out.
Yeah. So this quite quick. If legislation was coming up and finding a loophole like you just described, those changes could be quite quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
I think the scale is also, sorry, just to add, I think the scale is just entirely different also. So especially, I mean, the EU has completely changed over the invasion of Ukraine, because the EU was a user of sanctions, but no anywhere close to the type of use of sanctions that we saw coming from the US, and it still keeps increasing. So the EU still, because they need all the representatives of the member states need to agree on the sanctions that are being imposed on an EU level. So that makes it much more difficult than the use of, as Georgina mentioned, of executive order. So it's there's differences among economic interests among the member states. So it's a tedious process. And in a sense, if you think about that, it's kind of interesting and impressive that they managed to implement this massive package on Russia, in a sense. But still, because they are not yet moving towards a qualified majority voting for the imposition of sanctions anywhere close, it's gonna remain difficult, right, to be quick and agile when it comes to sanctions. So the use of sanctions is still much higher from the US side than it is on an EU level, and it's gonna remain that way for the foreseeable future. Also, when you look at the amount of countries that are actually subject to any type of sanctions from the US side, is much higher than from the EU side. The EU also, or the US also implements full embargo still, which is something that the EU has stepped away from.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. I mean, talking about the EU, we'll just jump into that point in a minute. So a question here is more about uncovering the ultimate beneficial owners within organizations. And it's how is sanctions compliance challenging in the European Union's context, particularly when there's a lack of publicly available UBO data in all the different EU countries? It's a challenge.
Yeah, it is challenging for several reasons. Like you have there limited transparency. UBO information, it's not uniformly accessible across EU member states. So it's creating gaps in the data available for due diligence. And there is inconsistent access. Are there differences in national regulations and the level of transparency in UBO registers? So this factor can make it difficult to obtain and to have complete information. So there is increased in due diligence burden. You have to have enhanced screening where businesses must undertake more strict and accurate due diligence processes so they can identify and verify the UBOs, and often requiring extensive manual checks and additional resources. So there is also a higher risk of non-compliance when you have incomplete or inaccessible UBO data, increases the risk of engaging with sanction entities. We also have regulatory discrepancies, the member states may have different standards for UBO data availability, leading to inconsistent compliance practices and difficulties in maintaining a unified approach. There is also the complexity in verification, where companies face challenges in verifying ownership structures, especially the complex one, and potential sanctions exposure due to inconsistent UBO data. And more often in practice, they face operational challenges. So there is, let's say, an increased need for specialized tools and expertise to manage the complexities of UBO data to ensure compliance. And in order to harmonize the practices, they face difficulties across different EU jurisdictions with varying levels of UBO transparency. Hence, we face coordination issues. So it is necessary to implement enhanced compliance strategies, including investing in advanced data management systems. So it's also more costly for the businesses, and working closely with local experts to navigate the complexities of UBO data across the European Union. So again, you must have a coordination and cooperation with others. And if, each member state has different approach, again, it's more and more challenging.
Absolutely. I mean, this speaks to the industry that I'm in, the KYB, and uncovering the UBO often, as I'm sure you very well know. And we have a lot of inbound inquiries, and people seem to think that actually we can just got a magic wand and we can get it. If only that was the case. And if it was, we probably wouldn't be in business, but that's not the case. And of course, uncovering a company and a shell scheme and a structure, it will take you cross-border and often sometimes outside of the EU. And these are even more lies a bigger, complex issue. And it just becomes costly. I suppose in our case, we kind of loosen that burden by reducing the time it takes to uncover certain areas. But when you get to a blocker where the UBO information isn't there, then you have to find other ways of finding the information. You're absolutely right what you say.
Exactly,
which, and still being compliant. Yeah.
I think it is also just interesting to see that the gap between banks and industry is also getting bigger here, because this is becoming a much more important element ever since the invasion, because there's so many Russians on sanctions list, right? And they are spread around all over the world, and there's these oligarchs who have like interest in all kinds of companies, and we know that every single day they are improving their techniques with shell companies and whatnot. So yeah, banks tend to have fancy tools and resources to get the best tools, but we are seeing that industries tends to lag behind because they simply don't have the type of resources for the most fancy equipment. So then it's kind of what does that leave you, industry versus banking?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't use that as an excuse when you come to get audited or fined. But of course,
exactly.
that is the reality. That of course banks are geared up for this, and I've always been pushing to have more shared information and more shared. When the banks have it, why can't it be open to regulated industries more? You know, and as more industries become more regulated, even the smaller ones, you know, from you name it, it's there. You know, property particularly, they're not as geared up for it as the banks. You're right to say that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then you also see the interesting differences between anti-money laundering regulations that put certain additional requirements on banks and financial institutions, while sanctions are applicable to all of us, right? So they're equally, so there's a difference there, but that's not always reflected then in, for example, access to UBO registers and those kind of things. So that's an interesting squeeze there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's slightly off topic, but often I'm talking to people that are uncovering that. So maybe it might be payment companies or whatever it might be. And I'm always drilling it down. They want the easiest solution, the quickest solution to try and get that information. But obviously, that's not always there. I always think the education should go back to the actual user that you're looking at and to tell them why it's important. You know, the actual reason why it's important. Why are we doing this in the first place? So I think that message needs to get through. And I always refer to my mum in these webinars, because if I say to my mum, this is what happens and this is why it happened, you know, then everyone gets it. That's what I say. So yeah.
No, that's a nice one. Yeah.
So we're coming to a last few questions here. We've rattled through this. So what are the main by multinational companies due to the differing EU and US sanctions? We might have covered some of this, but
I know multinational companies face several key compliance challenges due to these different EU and US sanctions regimes, and you always need to follow and see the differences and see what is related to you. And then because you're facing conflicting regulations, so since companies must navigate and adhere to both EU and US sanctions, may have conflicting requirements or target different entities and sectors. And especially by the US having the secondary sanctions on non-US entities interacting with sanction parties may also conflict with the EU's blocking and prohibiting compliance with certain US extraterritorial sanctions. So there is more complexity in implementation because we have different sanction lists, reporting obligations, enforcement practices that require companies to maintain a comprehensive compliance programs. And especially in regards to due diligence, companies must perform enhanced due diligence to ensure that they are not inadvertently violating either jurisdiction's sanctions. So they must be very careful there. And for example, in regards to the penalties and risks, there are severe US penalties for non-compliance, which can be more severe compared to the EU penalties, increasing risk for businesses. And in regards to the risk of legal action from the EU regulators for adhering to US sanctions or vice versa, is leading to potential conflicts and fines. So we have here also the operational impact. There are different sanctions that can lead to operational disruptions, such as restricted access to markets or partners, complicating business activities, the supply chains, also allocation for the resource, where there is high cost associated with implementing and maintaining a robust compliance systems to manage all these different sanctions requirements. One important challenge here is the regulatory uncertainty. Frequent updates and changes, as we mentioned earlier, in sanctions regulations from both the EU and US create uncertainty and require constant monitoring and adaptation, and always be updated, not to miss anything. And many companies, they have an extra stress on that, not to miss anything, and always be ahead. That is why it's crucial to have training and awareness. So training the staff on a regular basis, ensuring that the employees understand and adhere to complex and potentially conflicting sanctions regulations across the different regions. So to manage all these challenges, multinational companies need to develop comprehensive and adaptable compliance strategies to engage with all the legal experts and use advanced compliance technologies to track and navigate conflicting sanction requirements, and always be one step ahead if and when it's possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking then as you were talking around the amount of people that are in this compliance world. Obviously, it's increasing. It's a massively increasing area.
Yeah.
And for anyone that might, any of our viewers that might be listening today and thinking, well, actually, this might be a career for me. Obviously, training's coming up there, and I think we can fair to say that in most of these industries, and even if we look at the customs authorities, there is a lack of people power to be able to manage the changes that are there. Exactly. I think that's probably fair to say.
Yes.
Yeah. Before we move on to our final question that we have here in our question board, if there's anyone online listening in who wants to ask any further questions, please put them into the chat and we can bring them up. We've had a few ongoing comments, but they just seem to be talking. Well, thanks, Louis. He's made a really good comments about. Let me just have a look here what he's talking about. He's talking about how sanctions rapidly change and requires rapid implementation. AML and sanctions compliance. He's made a few good proper comments that we probably populated anyway as we were talking. So as I move on, one for you, Stephanie, really. How did the EU and the US differ in their approach to targeting individuals and entities?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a bit, I mean, how it works when we look at designating entities is that we have actually in the EU, the regulation, which is basically the framework, right? And in the US, we have either the act or the executive order, and it sets these so-called listing criteria. So it basically says all parties that are involved, Russian or parties involved or located in Russian, and they are involved in military complex and whatever could be designated under this sanction. And then it is up to the EU or the US or the UK, whoever is the sanction authority, to actually designate those parties that actually meet the criteria, the listing criteria in the regulation or the authority, if you want to call it more broadly. So that's kind of how this works. From the EU perspective, it is indeed the Council of the EU who decides ultimately, with the help of EU working groups, who they're actually going to designate under these regulations, which is a more tedious process than when we look at it from the US side of things, because OFAC has actually the authority to designate under the regulations as the one who's actually administering the sanctions program to designate. So that's very different also. So in that sense, it differs quite a bit. Yeah, I hope that. I mean, it's a bit of an opaque type of thing, because we don't. I mean, you always see when you look at the sanctions list, you're going to see a small description on why they are rationale on why they are listed, at least on the EU side. Also on the US side, but it's especially in the US side, it's very, very brief. It's only like a couple of words, while the EU is a little bit more descriptive. And yeah, that's about it. That's basically all we know. And interestingly, of course, there's also no due process. So that kind of clashes a little bit with, yeah, I mean, that's a whole discussion on its own, I think, interestingly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I was just thinking, I'm going to say this, there's clearly no wiggle room in that sense. It's either black or white.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So you're either designated or not, and the only thing you can do is, of course, appeal your listing, which is more successful when you do it in the EU, which is a big thing. So annulments have been done quite often successfully in the EU. The only thing is then, the council can also just amend the criteria and then put you back on the list again. So does that really have much? Maybe not so much.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Well, I think questions have been more about comments, not necessarily questions. And these questions that we've compiled today have come from our previous audiences anyway. So I think in summary, I just think just wonder if you've got any final comments before I summarize where we're at today, either of you.
Yeah, I think because we talked a little bit before on extraterritoriality, so maybe that is something that maybe could be interesting because there's quite some developments in that space. Because extraterritoriality is a big thing in the US traditionally, but we're actually seeing that the EU is, because of all the blockchain statute that we talked about in the beginning, they were very much taking a stance like we are not applying our sanctions extraterritorially yet. With all the new packages that are coming out on Russia, we see that they are actually shifting away from that stance, and that they are, because there is so much circumvention, and in order to make sure that this really that the sanctions bite, basically, they're moving into extraterritorial measures. So, for example, you see that in the last package, normally we would say EU sanctions only apply for EU entities located in the EU, but now they are actually implemented this best effort basis where they actually say, well, we expect you to do your best effort to also make sure that non-EU subsidiaries of EU companies also comply with EU sanctions. So you see kind of a shift there that is something that is interesting to really follow. And you're seeing that is really gradually moving away from that more traditional stance of no, we don't have extraterritorial measures. The price cap is another interesting example of that, because if we look at the price cap, so oil exports are no longer allowed within the EU, but if you look at the oil price cap, which is basically saying that only companies within the G7 can only ship or facilitate shipments outside of these jurisdictions when the oil is sold under a certain price, which is called the price cap, right? And if you think about that measure, it's actually very extraterritorial in nature, because we have an embargo on oil coming out of Russia into the EU, but we also supplement that with a oil price cap for all the oil that is going to third countries outside of the EU. So I think that is something that is very interesting for people to know.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, yes.
And Georgina, have you got any final comments before we summarize?
Just practical example of all we have discussed today for the challenges and the differences and the difficulties we are facing. For example, here in Cyprus, it's a very small island, and we are obliged by the law, for example, to follow EU and UN sanctions. But there is a very important recommendation that we should also follow US and UK. And when it regards to other countries and other member states of EU or any other country, again, you need to follow and check and see if it's in any relation with your clients or activities or anything, to seek a legal advice. So even though you are obliged by the law of your own, let's say, country to follow a specific package, again, all countries' sanctions are connected. So yeah, it's so much like a treasure hunting to check everything and make a combination and see if it's related, it's not related, and where to start and where to stop.
Yeah, So chief investigators, I'm going to put you down as.
Yeah, like inspectors Clouseau.
That's it. Very good.
Yeah.
So I think in summary, it's been a fantastic chat. We're drawing to the end now. So I'll just summarize briefly where I think we've got here. So, the differences between EU and US sanction programs significantly impact businesses. I'm sure we've got to that point, and then how they must approach compliance. Companies operating internationally need to understand the nuances of each regime, develop comprehensive compliance strategies, as you say to your words, be an investigator and look beneath it and look at those risks, and obviously stay informed about what changes in sanction policies there are. And by doing so, they can effectively manage the risk, and they can effectively ensure that they adhere to both EU and US and others requirements, which I think it's fair to say that us sitting here today, it's no mean feat. I think we could probably say that it's a challenge, and it's a changing challenge every time. So I thank you very much for your time. It's been very informative, and if any of our audience wants to reach out to you independently, then I'm sure we'll pass that on. And yeah, I thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you for having us.
Thank you.